welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by our very own Ezra Harker Shaw, author of the novel The Aziola's Cry. Ezra, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Colin. I'm really pleased to be here.
I want to start with the lives of Mary and Percy Shelley because a lot of readers will be familiar with the works, their literary works, especially something like Frankenstein, but maybe not as familiar with their personal lives, which this novel that you've written kind of highlights. So, can you kind of just give us a basic background of what their personal lives were like during the time period that you write about?
Yeah, I mean, they have such incredible lives, I think. Percy Shelley is really born into an aristocratic family and could have had a very comfortable life, I think, if he'd followed a more kind of normal route. Mary Shelley was the daughter of William Godwin, who's a famous philosopher. They were, much poorer, kind of just on the kind of the cusp of what we would call middle class today. They met when she was just 16, he was 20, and they really kind of fell in love, had a whirlwind romance with the small inconvenience that he was married already. So this relationship was widely condemned by everybody around them. And them being the kind of people they were, they didn't decide to bow to convention, but ran away together. And they have an incredibly turbulent life. We're looking at the start of the 19th century. They're really living outside of society's norms, running from England to France to Italy, living a very peripatetic life, with a great deal of tragedy as well, with the kind of a lot of losses in their lives, and writing constantly an absolutely astonishing amount in what was for Percy Shelley a very short life. My book focuses really on just the time that the two of them spent together, up until his death when he was just 29 years old. Mary Shelley lives a much longer life, which I'm hoping to write a sequel, which I'm currently vaguely squirreling away and scheming on. So I'm not going to say too much about her later life, but for this one, I'm looking at those few traumatic years that they spend together.
You mentioned that Mary might have been able to live a very comfortable life, but chose not to. What were the values that Mary and Percy were kind of extolling, and why did they decide those values were worthy enough to run away together?
Oh, that's a lovely one. I mean, the Percy Shelley seems to have just been a kind of conscientious objector his whole life. He when he was at university, he went to Oxford University. He went to Eton. He went to all the kind of best schools, had every privilege he could have had as a young man. When he was in Oxford, he wrote this book called The Necessity of Atheism because he was an atheist, and he saw a lot of the main thing he argued with was that he saw a lot of hypocrisy in the running of the way the church was currently operating at that time. And he not only did he write this book, but he sent it to every member of staff within the university. He was really like, I'm not happy with this, and I'm not happy to be silent about this. Um, they had, I think, what we would today call very liberal ideas. They had kind of dreams of a kind of utopian community where there wouldn't be structures of social hierarchy, where there wouldn't be the kind of the oppression that was such, so we have a big difference today in between rich and poor, but at that time it was so much more so. And that was a big issue that was we can see in things like the French Revolution, which was really not just before Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley are around. There was still a lot of people saying, okay, there are all these rich people who own all the land. They kind of keep everybody else in poverty. Um, and I think the Shelleys just saw all the kind of normal roots of life as somehow contributing to that. They staged their own very small little protests, um, and that wasn't always a kind of very engaged, active um, activism, but it was their way of saying we're not going to be part of this world. Percy Shelley wouldn't eat sugar because he knew that slaves were used in the sugar plantations, and so he wasn't kind of somebody who knew anything he could do about that. But he had some kind of he had a very strong moral compass, and I think he was very vocal about that and refused to be part of a system that oppressed anyone.
Well, and because of that, they had some basic problems of paying bills, of finding a place to live, something we really don't see or kind of imagine from these genius literary artists that we now see as celebrities in the literary world. So, what was that like for them, just trying to get by?
Mm, I think I think they have really different experiences from it, and I think the big difference is that Mary comes from a family uh, that had known versions of poverty. I don't want to say full poverty, but they'd had to move house because they couldn't afford the rent. And they'd kind of uh, they as a family, the Godwin family, had quite a few times felt how close they were to the edge. Um, Percy Shelley has a really kind of reckless approach to money sometimes. I think he has a feeling that money will always ultimately find him, and it does to a great extent. They get into all kinds of perilous situations, and their first great elopement, they end up in France, and then they just suddenly don't have money anymore, and they have a really small amount to sort of try and get back to England. They're in a foreign country and just they haven't got anything. Um, but they have a lot of rich friends out there. They know people like Lord Byron, who has coins to spare, and they do sort of always manage to get by on a wing and a prayer, as it were.
Well, let's talk more about Lord Byron. He appears throughout the
Yeah.
novel. What was his relationship like with Percy and with Mary, and how did he kind of influence their lives and their writing?
Byron is such a fascinating figure historically. Like he's such a larger than life figure. Um, in terms of the Shelleys, he has a really amazing relationship, I think, with both of them. That's incredibly significant in their lives. He is the big celebrity at that time. Like, people often don't know how famous writers were in their own time. Nobody really knew who Percy Shelley was. Nobody really knew who Mary Shelley was, but after Frankenstein came out, everybody knew what Frankenstein was, even if they didn't know too much about its author. But Lord Byron is often kind of referred to as the first major celebrity. And the Shelleys come into Byron's life through Mary's stepsister, Claire, uh, who is just kind of the most tenacious human being. And she decides she's going to go and befriend this celebrity and just basically just sends him a note saying, I want to meet you and I'm going to come and meet you and we're going to have a good time. And Lord Byron, being a person who likes a good time, is sufficiently interested to say, okay, she can come in. And that kind of Claire brings Byron into the Shelleys' lives. I think he's intimidating to Percy Shelley because he's such a huge personality. He's such a gifted poet. Byron rarely edits his poetry. He'll just kind of write it, slapdash, right, it's finished, it's perfect. I know very few writers who write like that, and I know an awful lot of writers, some of them really, really brilliant ones. I've never met anyone who can just dash off brilliant poetry like that. Um, and as I say, his celebrity is so huge. So I think there's a relationship with Shelley where Shelley immensely admires him, but is also intimidated by him and frustrated with him because Shelley is, as I said, kind of someone who has very strong religious but moral beliefs about the world and really wants to improve the world. A lot of his writing is about how can I improve things, and Byron is really a cynic at heart. And Byron is very politically involved at times, but never from the same kind of seeking an ideal. In a way, he's much more grounded, and he's much more like, well, everybody's corrupt, everything's useless. I think I can help those guys over there. I'm going to send them some money, see if that does anything. But one thing I found so interesting, and I don't think there's been nearly enough written about this, is Byron's relationship with Mary Shelley. There aren't a lot of women in Byron's life that he treats as human beings. He's quite up for having some relations with them. But his relationship with Mary is really very lovely. He has great respect for her as a writer from what he's written about Frankenstein. So it really says this is an extraordinary achievement. Um, for such a young woman, especially. She's only kind of 19, I think, by the time it comes out. And as I was researching them, I found all these little lovely moments between the two of them, especially after the death of one of Mary's children. She was, really having a very difficult time, and she wasn't writing that much. And I think that's a sort of sign for Mary that things aren't going well if she's not writing. And she starts doing copy work for Lord Byron, and he's never asked her to do this at any other time. But that to me was a lovely kind of moment of it seemed to me like potentially this was a moment of him going, I think you need something to do. I think I can find a way to give you something. And when I see their letters, there's a lot of respect for her to him. There's a lot of disapproval from her of how he kind of conducts himself and a lot of the relationships he has. But I think they have a really nice friendship, sort of, and I think in a way they have more similar mindsets perhaps than either of them do with Percy Shelley, who's so idealistic and grand, and Mary and Byron, I think, have a similar kind of, yeah, the world's a bit messed up, isn't it? Well, we'll make the best of it.
Well, you covered a lot there, and I have several comments and some more questions.
You got
Um,
to stop me. I'm so excited about these guys. I'll just rap it for ages.
yeah. Well, first, the dialogue, the conversations between Percy and Lord Byron are really fascinating throughout the novel. That must have been pretty fun for you to write. But yeah, they are really great thinkers, kind of going back and forth about philosophical things. And then I also love the way, so Lord Byron is kind of in the story as a younger man, and then he comes back in 5, 6, 7 years later. And the way you hint at his age, that age is creeping up on him. I just love that physical description of him. I thought you did such a great job with that. But I want to ask more about getting to know these people because you talked about reading their letters. And I think you started working on this well before it was ever going to be a novel. So you've been getting to know these people for a long time, and now you're working on a sequel, you said. Tell me what that's been like to really get a sense of who they are and what it's just that whole journey has been for you discovering these great artists as people.
Oh, I've loved them a long time. Like they really they feel very entrenched in my life now. Um, I think this. Where did this start? Uh, I, I loved Percy Shelley. I discovered Percy Shelley's poetry first, and then I remember going being at university and being in a lecture on Frankenstein, and there was just quite a small point of like, oh, and Mary Shelley was married to the poet Percy Shelley, and I just said, oh wait, what? Who are these people? Like, what was that conversation of these two wonderful writers? What were their lives like together? And I, at some point in my undergraduate career, I went to a talk by Richard Holmes, who's a great Shelley scholar, wrote a brilliant biography of Percy Shelley. And afterwards, I asked him, is there a good book on Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley? I'd love to read it. I want to know more about their lives together. And there was this great little moment where he just sort of went there, there's been a few bits and pieces, but no one's done a really good book about the two of them. And then he just kind of shrugged and went, maybe you should write it. And it was a really throwaway thing. He'd never met me before. He didn't know anything about me, but that just put the little thing in my head. And after that kind of went on, I did a master's degree, and I decided I wanted to do a PhD that was researching the collaboration between the two Shelleys, because I'd found all these little places where, they'd written a diary together. He'd put some notes in Frankenstein. She'd given him some advice about some of his plays. And I wanted to know, oh, great, well, how much did they actually do? What's all the evidence? So I started all of that, um, and did a huge amount of work looking at, as I say, reading through their diaries, their manuscripts, their notebooks, spotting their handwriting, looking at where they're passing pens back and forward, so I can see his handwriting, and then in the same ink, Mary picks up the story, and just things like this. But I always had this thing in mind, like, oh, I'd love to do this as a novel. I'd love to see this as a novel. And so I was sort of telling myself, oh, when I finish this PhD, I think I'll write a novel. That would be great. And I've always done creative writing, so it kind of felt really natural to me. And it was a fellow PhD student when I was talking through what I'd done so far, where I was at, and all this excitement I had about this novel, and I couldn't wait to finish the PhD and get onto the novel. She said, "I think you're doing the wrong PhD. I think you should be doing this as a novel." And that was one of those moments where I was sat there going, "Oh no, you've just told me something that is true, and there's going to be a lot of work." So I'm incredibly grateful to her for that moment. Um, and I'm really grateful as well to the university because I sort of went in with some trepidation, going, "Look, I think I need to shift this into a creative writing project. Still want to express the same things I've been researching about these two people and their lives together. Um, but I want to express it as a novel rather than as a traditional kind of literature PhD," and was supported by that by the university, which was really incredible. So that's been a good 10 years of just hanging out with Byron and the Shelleys.
So the Mary's life is devastating. It's almost unbelievable what she went through. Can you talk a bit about what she went through, what that must have been like for her mental health, and how you're able to kind of tackle it in the novel? Because it can't just be about sadness and grief. So what are you able then creatively in order to bring out from this story within all that tragedy?
I thought the mental health thing was such an interesting angle of it because they were writing at a time when people didn't talk about mental health the way we did, and I very deliberately wanted to depict the mental, the devastation she went through, um, and to try and sort of see that through a lens of kind of contemporary understandings of depression and grief. Um, I think so. So they, for context, for anyone who's not familiar with the story, the Shelleys lost several children. First, a newborn baby didn't live past. I don't think they made it to 2 weeks old, and that was Mary was very young then, still a teenager when she lost that first baby, and I think that was a really traumatic event to go through at a really difficult time. Subsequently, later on, they lost two of their older children, which was just a tragedy nobody should have to go through. Um, and further to which, the Percy Shelley's first wife, Harriet, and indeed um, Mary's half sister, Fanny Godwin, they both commit suicide. And I think both Mary and Percy have a huge amount of guilt over those two suicides. Um, I think they both kind of know that their actions contributed to those people's unhappiness, and don't necessarily want to say they are to blame entirely because people's lives are vast and complex things. But I think they both felt a significant amount of guilt there, and it was a really difficult thing as I was planning out the novel. I was talking with my supervisor, and as I was kind of doing the PhD, and he's saying, that there's an inconvenient amount of grief from the terms of plotting a novel. And he's saying if you were making this up as just a purely fictional novel, I would say, okay, you can't have this much grief in one story. Uh, and as I was writing it, I was sort of trying to find the counterpoints because even when life is terrible, even when you're going through something really, really difficult, there are moments of beauty and happiness. There are moments of um, trying to get yourself out of that situation, and also moments when you find, despite everything, you do feel happy. And then very often you feel guilty at your happiness. But I also wanted to show two different approaches, not two different approaches, but two different responses to grief. Um, I don't think Percy Shelley's grief is less than Mary Shelley's, but I think it is very different. I think she has a very kind of melancholic nature that does kind of lead her to kind of sink into a depression where she just doesn't want to do things a lot of the time. She doesn't want to talk to people. And his response to something very sad is to sort of run and try and dispel sadness and find passion in life. And at times that was a difficult relationship for the two of them. I think that they had such different reactions, and at a time when they needed each other the most, they didn't always want the same things from each other, and that took a lot of time for them to work out. I think as couples do need to take time to work things out. Yeah.
I want to talk about, well, maybe if you could talk about the cover and the title, The Osceola's
Mm.
Cry, where what inspired the title, and then also can you talk about what the cover looks like and what
Mhm.
that's based on?
Yeah. The title, The Asiola's Cry, I spent ages debating a title for this book. I really wanted to have, um, I thought it should be something Shelleyan, to take that to mean either of them. I kept thinking, oh, a quote would be really wonderful as a way to kind of something that connected them. But I didn't want it to be a Percy Shelley novel. I didn't want it to be a Mary Shelley novel. That's something I've really felt strongly the whole way through. I don't want this to be one of their stories and not the other ones. So as soon as I was picking any quote, I found a couple of lovely lines from Prometheus Unbound. There are some lovely bits in Frankenstein and Matilda, and I thought, oh, either of those would be great, but I don't want to just pick one of them. And then I had this sort of moment of come, coming across the Asiola's Cry again and going, oh, this is fantastic. So this is a poem by Percy Shelley that begins, "Do you hear the Asiola's cry?" said Mary. And so it's Percy Shelley writing down a moment when Mary turns to him and says, "Oh, do you hear that?" Um, and he instantly goes, "What's an Asiola?" Which is what everybody has said to me since I have told them the title of my book. And an Asiola is an owl. It's the Asiolo. I think it's is the contemporary Italian name for it. Um, but it's this moment of he one, it's a lovely moment of the two of them that he chooses to write this little poem of just them sitting one evening on the beach in Italy and hearing this bird. And for a moment, he's afraid that, oh, the Asiola is going to be someone he doesn't want to talk to. It's going to be some person who is going to disturb this quiet little moment they have. And then I said, oh no, it's the owl. And he goes, oh, it's that beautiful sad owl I hear crying. And he instantly kind of connects it as this image of sadness, but one that's making this beautiful sound. Which is he writes quite a bit about birds, and the nightingale is this very famous one where he writes that a poet is like a nightingale who sings in solitude to cheer itself. And I always thought so beautiful. So I thought, oh, it's a lovely moment in the Shelley's history, and it's both of them talking together. Um, and so for this, I thought, oh, wouldn't it be lovely to have an owl on the cover of the book? And I'm just really enamored with the cover of the book for video. For those of you on audio, I'll describe it. It's a beautiful painting by a pre-Raphaelite artist, Cameron Prinsep. I think I've got that right. I feel like there's another name in there somewhere. Um, but it's this beautiful pre-Raphaelite painting of a woman with red hair stroking this beautiful owl. And I find it a really lovely painting. Just there's a lot of sadness and there's a lot of intelligence, and the owl is looking out at you. And I feel like the owl has a sort of spirit quality that it knows something, and the rest of us are us humans are trying to work out what that might be. Um, but I have a big fondness for owls. I love Minerva's owl as well, so it's a symbol that's very important to me.
Well, it's a lovely story about the title that I didn't actually know until now. And
Mm.
yeah, the title and the cover definitely fit well together. Can you talk a little bit about your journey to publication? You've done other creative works such as playwriting, I believe, and
Mm.
you're a teacher of creative writing. Um, but then when it comes to finding someone to publish your book, that's always a learning process for everyone. And
Yeah.
a little bit, just for my own selfish reasons, I kind of want to know,
Mhm.
you're in the United Kingdom.
Mhm.
We at History Through Fiction are in Minnesota in the United States of America. How did you find us, and what was the process like for you then deciding to say, yeah, I think I would like to have History Through Fiction publish my novel?
Mhm. I think I had a slightly strange process because I had started with the novel as a PhD. That as a PhD, you're kind of doing something quite experimental in your style, and I was aware a lot of the times I was doing it, this probably wasn't going to be how I was going to want to publish it. What I was going to be doing for the PhD was a slightly different beast from what I would want to excuse me, what I would want to put out into the world. Um, and I think, as you said, this is my first sort of full novel. I've previously done a lot of poetry and a lot of, well, a few plays. Um, I Poetry I love, and I love to kind of just share poetry. I share poetry on social media. I just kind of have a blog, a Harker blog, and I have a Harker Facebook page where I kind of share just some people have the kind of, oh no, don't share things online, you've got to save them for publication, and to me, I just kind of want people to read them. So I was just like, no, I'm going to put them out there. And I love to read at poetry nights. I'm very lucky to be currently living in London, which has so many wonderful spoken word nights. So that's a great place to go and meet other poets and share poetry. um, and Playwriting was a wonderful experience for me. I've always loved theater, and I got involved with a little theater group who started out, Pajoda Theater Company. They started out doing Chekhov, did a lovely series of Chekhov shorts, and I'd been thinking of this story, and I thought about it as a novel, and I thought, I think I'd like this as a play. It was called Tolstoy Tried to Kill My Girlfriend. Uh, and it's about a writer who's writing a story, a queer writer writing a story, and has decided to kill off the main character's girlfriend. And then I just thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if she comes out the book and goes, "How dare you kill my girlfriend?" And then they're in this kind of liminal dream space where they can both summon writers to argue their case over whether or not a character should die. So it was a very fun play to do. Tolstoy and Anna Karenina come on and both argue from different sides. Magwitch and Miss Havisham come on. We have lots of kind of fun, eccentric characters popping in and out. And playwriting, I cannot recommend enough as a writer, as a part of the writer's process, because you get to hand your work to other people. You're not the final person in the way that you're a novelist. You kind of, I mean, I think it had huge amounts of inputs from all sorts of people. But as a novelist, ultimately, it's you, and you're the kind of final step. But you get the final say in a play. You hand it to actors, and what they finally say on the stage is the final step. And that was so interesting, having people questioning, why did you do this with your characters? So that's just kind of a little bit of my background for this book. I think for a while when I was looking at publication, I started out by kind of contacting agents. I thought that would be, I was aware that's kind of so often the traditional way, and I did some research. And my first three choices of agents kind of all got back to me going, "Oh, this is really interesting. It's not quite right for us just now with what we've kind of got, but we were interested." And then I started sending it out to agents that I wasn't so, they hadn't resonated with me for any particular reason, and perhaps unsurprisingly, I didn't kind of get the responses back. And I was started sending it out to a couple of independent publishers, and I always do research on publishers before sending it out. I know some people who will just spam out a manuscript to absolutely everyone they can. Um, and um, I came across history through fiction, not while I was looking for publication particularly. I came across My Mother's Secret, and I thought, oh, this is just looked like a nice novel. Um, just kind of reading it through, and as I was reading it, I was like, oh, who's history through fiction? Who's this? And then as soon as I kind of went onto the website, I went, oh, this is what I have been looking for. This is a publisher of historical fiction who cares about historical accuracy. Um, and because various people I've been talking to when I talked about historical fiction, they sort of I discussed my manuscript, what I was doing, and they're like, yeah, people don't really care that much about historical accuracy. We more want something a bit flamboyant, a bit fun. Can you make it a bit sexier? Can you kind of throw in something a bit radical? And I'm like, I don't want to do that. I love accurate historical fiction. I love historical fiction that teaches me something. I don't like when I can't trust the author that they're telling me the truth. And so I remember kind of telling my partner, being like, I found this really interesting publisher, and I'm really excited about this one. So yeah, I sent it over to you guys, and I'm so glad that this is where it's ended up, because I love everything else that you're publishing, and it feels like something really important to me. This idea of writing historical fiction and being sincere, respecting the people that you're writing about, the time you're writing about, and saying, I'm going to try and tell this story with as much honesty as I can, whether those are real historical people, or if you're just a historical circumstance. I think that's a really special thing.
Well, I'm so glad that that resonated with you. I mean, that's kind of what I was searching for, uh, and I'm glad that there are writers and readers out there that share that viewpoint. And boy, you said it so well. I mean, I should hire you to do our publicity and grow our audience. Well, we talked a little bit about before the interview what you're working on next, and you're very busy with several projects, but you have some ideas about a sequel for the Osceola's Cry. What can you tell us about where you're headed with the sequel?
So that is the title is Mary After Shelley, because I think in the Shelley history, a few people know about their lives together. People know little scraps. I think one of the main things people know is that kind of that very famous night with Mary and Percy Shelley and Lord Byron when they proposed to write a ghost story, and people maybe know about his kind of him dying young. Really, not a lot of people read Mary Shelley's other works, and people don't know too much about her life after his death. And that's partly because she went to a lot of, to a great extent, to hide her life, to have a very quiet life. But she really got up to some fascinating stuff. One of the very interesting things is her life with Jane Williams. They were very close. Some people are kind of theorizing perhaps they had a queer relationship, but I want to look into that. She was definitely involved with a lot of historical queer people, and I'm always interested in hearing those stories, because as a queer person myself, I often hear people say, "Oh, there just weren't queer people in history. This is a fashion of today." And that's just absolutely not true. One of the really interesting events of Mary Shelley's life, she is involved in forging a passport for a person we would today refer to as a trans man, so that he can basically run away to France and marry his wife. Which is a kind of, it's fascinating as a story that she's involved in this. And the whole time she's really putting on this front of being a very respectable Victorian lady, because she's trying to basically just get some money for her son and give him the best life that she can. Um, but at the same time, she's involved in all of these kind of wonderful adventures. So it's interesting from a Mary Shelley studies point of view, but it's really interesting also in a queer histories story, that this is a story that was lost for years. And it was the scholar Betty Bennett in the 90s, I think, who discovered the kind of history of this writer, David Lindsay, who was previously known as Mary Diana Dodds, and how this writer actually changed their gender entirely and just became a whole new person. And for ages, historians just looked at those two people as two different people. And then, um, Betty Bennett comes along and goes, wait a second, this is the same person. This is the same person. They pop up in another country and under another name. And this passport, Mary's the one who gets this. Oh, from my friend. And people had always said, why is she getting this passport from this friend that we have never heard her mention before? It's because they've just made up a name. And so, yeah, she's involved in some really great stuff. So I'm really excited to bring that story. Um, to people to learn a bit more, and to promote some of her later works as well, because anyone who likes Frankenstein or is interested in Mary Shelley, her other works like The Last Man, which was a slightly terrifying one. It's about a plague in 21st century, mostly in Europe, but it goes through America as well, which I was teaching during COVID, and it all felt a little bit uncanny. And then also her historical novel Castruccio, which was a big influence on my historical novel in her life. Well, sometimes it's published as Castruccio, sometimes as Valperga, is about a great historical female figure, and is her kind of Mary Shelley at her most feminist, writing about how history treats women. So yeah, more people need to know about her later life.
Yeah, it all sounds very interesting and important, and I hope you get to sit down and write it soon.
Yes.
Well, Ezra, I'll just end by saying, I was not very familiar with Mary and Percy Shelley's lives and their writing, but a part of the reason that I brought you on to History Through Fiction is because your writing is just so beautiful and like unbelievable how good of a writer you are. And it even felt a little audacious when we were working through we had the editing process. It's like, well, I have to find a way to make this a stronger narrative maybe, and that was really challenging because you have such a way with words. So
Well, thank you.
congratulations on the Asiel's Cry. Thank you so much for letting us be a part of it and helping us share this story. And it's just been such a pleasure to talk to you.
No, it's been. I mean, I'm so happy to be working with History Through Fiction, and Colin, your edits have been absolutely so incredibly helpful. I'm really pleased to be working with you and to be finally bringing this book to the world.
Well, thanks, Ezra. I wish you so much success with this novel.
Thank you, Colin. That's good.